This is Van Vance. You're listening to the Proffitt Report Podcast with Doug Proffitt.
It was stolen, and then it became an international news story. People line up in bitter cold weather, standing for hours just to get their hands on one single bottle. Some bourbon drinkers hoard it, never even opening a bottle. Hey everyone, this is Doug Proffitt. I'm talking about Pappy Van Winkle, the bourbon. But did you know that Pappy was a real person? He was also a wealthy bourbon executive in Louisville, who could have had any seat he wanted at Churchill Downs for the Kentucky Derby, but instead chose Derby Day in 1935 to roam his brand new distillery in Shively. The man who created the bourbon in Pappy's name many years later is his grandson, Louisville's Julian Van Winkle. In this edition of the Proffitt Report Podcast, we begin with a quote from Pappy himself, read by Julian.
We make fine bourbon, and a profit if we can, a loss if we must, but always fine bourbon.
Those are the words, folks, of the legendary Pappy Van Winkle, spoken by his grandson, the man who actually created Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, Julian Van Winkle. Julian, thanks for coming in and allowing me to reminisce about your grandfather.
Sure, it's always fun.
I love the story that in May of 1935, the 61st Kentucky Derby, Pappy Van Winkle was not at the Derby. What was he doing that day?
He planned or didn't plan to open Stitzel-Weller on Derby Day 1935. So obviously he did not go the track. Some people have asked, did he go to the races that day? And obviously he was more concerned with his new business venture. But he was there at the distillery and started making whiskey.
Folks, during this podcast, we're going to learn about the man. There was a man named Pappy Van Winkle. The most ironic thing that I found and the years now that I've researched him and have interviewed you for television is that most people who drink Pappy Van Winkle do not realize that he was a real character, and he himself never knew about Pappy Van Winkle. He died in 1965.
Right.
February 1965.
Yep.
So did you find that sort of the product came before the knowledge and the education of that this was a real man who lived and died in Louisville, Kentucky?
Yeah, it started with me going through a file drawer in my basement at my house, just looking through some old actually, there were a bunch of tax returns down there that I was looking to throw out, and I came across this picture, which, of course, I had seen before, but it was an 8.5 by 11 black and white glossy photo of Pappy, the iconic now picture of him lighting the cigar. And I said, well, I've got this older 20-year-old whiskey that I had purchased from another distillery since my dad had sold our old distillery in 1972. So I said, well, I'd like to honor my grandfather with this great picture of him and put it on a label and then see if it'll fly. Because I had no idea if this is going to work or not. But I had the older whiskey available and it was good, so I thought I'd put his name on it.
And we're going to dive into the story of the photograph here in just a minute. But first, I want to let people know that Julian Van Winkle Sr., that's Pappy.
Right.
You're Julian Van Winkle III.
Right.
Julian Van Winkle Sr. graduated from Center College in 1893, and then at age 20, walked down Main Street on Whiskey Row at the time, and walked into his first job. Do you know where that was?
Yeah, working for Mr. W.L. Weller down there on Main Street. And when it was the Stitzel Distillery was making their whiskey for them, Weller just being a wholesaler, so it was down there around Preston or Main Street or First Street is where their office building was. And he was actually about 18 when he did that. We're not 100% sure. He went to 4 years in school in Center College, but regardless, he didn't follow his father or his uncle into politics because they were both Secretary of State of Kentucky.
So 1893, here's the deal. The building that he walked into, W.L. Weller, by the way, is still there. It's this sort of gorgeous pinkish cast iron building that sits next to the Irish restaurant on Whiskey
Row, and it is unoccupied. It is still sort of boarded up, one of the few there. And then I guess right next to it would begin the now old Forester complex there. Right. Mm-hmm. So he was working when Whiskey Row was alive and really known as Whiskey Row.
Right. Yep. There were hundreds of distilleries, I guess, around the state, and several in Louisville and several on Main Street.
How did he get the name Pappy?
That was given to him by a friend of his, whose name was Castleman. Last name was Castleman, and I guess after he was in the business for a while, just came up, who knows, but he sure started, he stuck with it and became known as Pappy, not Julian P. Van Winkle, but Pappy Van Winkle.
Was he known as Pappy as a young man?
I don't think so. I think it was just when he got into the whiskey business.
So he was a salesman, and he would go down the street. Stitzel was a major distillery in Butchertown, and the Stitzel headquarters building is still there, at least the facade. It's part of a sort of a guy owns machinery and stuff like that, mechanical stuff. I know you've tried to buy that building in the past.
Yeah, the whole building is actually still there. The office building is intact, and it's part of Charlie Ettinger's truck built business down there, but it's all one big parcel, so he didn't want to break things up, because it would have been fun to have that building again and kind of go back in history.
So Pappy would walk or maybe shuttle down from where the W.L. Weller building was to Stitzel in Butchertown, and then suddenly he becomes this bourbon executive and opens his own distillery on Derby Day, the 61st Kentucky Derby, 1935. How did all that come together that he's down in Shively opening this, what becomes one of the most famous distilleries in America?
Well, his partners were Alex Farnsley and Mr. Stitzel. So the three of them, Pappy being the salesman, Farnsley being the money guy, and the Stitzel obviously being the whiskey maker of the trio. And they had plans during Prohibition, I'm sure, to build this distillery after Prohibition. And those are some of the black and white movies you've seen. That was on one of your TV shows with my sister about showing the construction of the distillery. So I guess they were just waiting for Prohibition to end. But again, they were one of the lucky ones. Stitzel was one of the lucky distilleries that was allowed to continue making whiskey during Prohibition, one of the 6 or 7 that were allowed.
So again, Pappy never drank Pappy Van Winkle. I guess people would think he probably did since his face is on the bottle. What bourbon did he make?
His brands were obviously W.L. Weller, which was part of he and Mr. Farnsley became officers of Stitzel Weller once they merged after Prohibition. So W.L. Weller, and then they started producing. They bought the old Fitzgerald label around Prohibition, and also later on, my dad created the Rebel Yell label in the 60s and Cabin Still. So four brands and several private label brands for hotels and restaurants around the country, but 4 brands and several different private ones, but they were all the same recipe, using the wheated recipe.
The bourbon executives weren't known like they are today. Although Pappy was a major figure, he wasn't this superstar, but he was higher profile than others because he was such a character, because he wrote columns and letters and things. What describe those things that were out there to really market what he was doing?
Yeah, he was kind of he really not completely serious about it all the time, and put a lot of humor into his sales pitches, and had these 1/3 column ads in Time and Newsweek and Sports Illustrated and different magazines around the country, which he became famous for, and they were very anecdotal, and he would tell little funny stories that related to selling his brand of whiskeys.
Here's some of the headlines. All in favor of flavor, say aye. Or how to stay married for life, stick to one model, like we do with Old Fitzgerald.
Right.
Those are his headlines.
Yeah. He had, we have a file of 50 of those little columns sitting around, and it's fun to go back and read those. They're very, very interesting. I don't know if they would work today, but because a lot of them concerned little farmers down the road and buggy and wagons and so forth, and horse-drawn buggies and pretty funny stuff.
So he wrote thank you letters to people who just visited him. He was a well-liked man. He believed in handshake deals.
Yep. Yeah, just handshake, definitely. Probably very little contracts with anybody, and it worked very well for him because he became very well respected, and right before he died was the oldest active distiller in the country.
There's these great pictures of him in these hunting overalls, I guess, or his camouflage, on the Stitzel Weller property in Shively. What was he doing there?
Even as a child, we used to go out and shoot doves on the weekends because there were cornfields and millet fields surrounding the property. So back then, the county laws or city laws didn't prevent firing a gun or shotgun within the county. So on his property, he would go out there and shoot birds, and there was a clay pigeon thrower there for practice and salespeople that wanted to come and visitors and so forth. So it was a lot different than it is today, but really just part of the unique situation he had there at Stitzel-Weller.
The business was sort of fun. It was family. And what would he do with the birds he would shoot? Did he keep them there in the office, or?
Oh, he'd take them home and clean them, and we'd have them for dinner. So put them in the freezer for sure.
What do you remember about him?
He was, I guess I was 15 when he passed away. I do remember going hunting with him. We would go hunting down on River Road, kind of where the sand companies are now, and the metal businesses are, scrap metal business. But there were some cornfields down there, even on River Road where Cox's Park is. So just hunting with him was fun, and of course my father too. And it was very unique to have their hunting dogs fenced in and living out at the distillery right behind the cooper shop. So they ate very well, because a lot of the scraps from the cafeteria at the distillery would end up in the dog bowls for lunchtime for the dogs. So it was pretty unique. And he'd take the dogs on the tours with the people when they went around the distillery.
Your sister gave me a line that summed up his life the most amazing way. She said he traveled by mule, horse and buggy, automobile, train, and plane, that he transcended all of those decades and generations and change in our country.
Yep. He, of course, started out in 1893, would have been the horse and buggy part, and traveled up to northern Kentucky and lived up there for quite a while. He would go out for weeks at a time, maybe even months, and come back and recharge his batteries and go out again.
The bourbon industry was different back then, wasn't it? I mean, what do you think he's up there today saying about what he would be witnessing down here?
Well, I think he'd be blown away with the volume of product that's being sold these days, plus the amount of new craft distillers that are out there getting into the business at this point. So he would be very proud of what he and my father were selling back then, which is so popular now, which is aged premium wheated bourbon whiskey. So I told someone the other day, I think they're about 50 or 60 years before their time, unfortunately.
Pappy never saw the decline in bourbon, did he?
Not really. He, dying in 65, it really didn't start to hit the skids until late 60s and early 70s.
And pick up on what you said about what he made. Why is that a distinctive bourbon compared to others? And why would he be proud? Are there many out there like that now? The aged wheated, as you said. Yeah,
of course, the aging part takes time, as you can imagine. But the wheated recipe, everything, say 10 years ago, 5-10 years ago, was all related to Pappy, and mainly his brands, his 4 brands. Maker's Mark has wheat in it, and he had some influence on Mr. Samuels as far as when he started his distillery. But the new distilleries are more and more of them are starting to use wheat in their recipe, along with the rye. They have several different recipes, but the wheated bourbon is really becoming very popular and something people are trying for sure.
What would his day have been like? So he gets up, the home that he lived in and the home where he died is in Louisville. It's in the highlands of Louisville, and he would have gotten up. What would it have been like?
Well, when I knew him, he would be driven to the office. I've never seen him drive a car. I don't think too many have, but he had a driver that would pick him up and carry him to Stitzel-Weller from the Highlands there. And he would, go about his daily routine as far as checking quality and checking with sales reps around the country and distributors, and working with my father and uncle to, make this thing work.
Why do you think he was so well liked? Was it his sense of humor?
It obviously was that, but he was a very smart businessman. He was invited to speak with Congress several times on behalf of the bourbon business in Kentucky and try and improve the laws and just to help the whole industry out. But his sense of humor and the amount of people that he attracted was just incredible, and people really never would forget him once they would meet this guy, because he had his hat and his cane, and he's always dressed up in his vest and tie and his little famous golfing outfit, so to speak. So he's a pretty funny guy.
There's a couple of there's the home film that you all shared with us when we did our story in November of 2014 of Pappy and his wife, Katie Smith, who you all knew, called Nana, on the beach, fully dressed. I mean, describe what they were wearing. There you are down on this beautiful, gorgeous day. People are in their swim trunks, and they're in a full outfit.
Right. I guess, I don't know if they just been to church or what, but they are, it's like they were in church or had just come from church, because everybody else is just relaxing, probably on the beach at, I don't know if it was Delray or Sarasota or where it was in Florida, but they just appeared, and they got a picture of them. It's pretty classic to see Nan in her hat and Pappy with his cane and his hat and just standing there on the beach, and we're all just hanging around in the swimsuits.
And then one of the best photographs that you've replicated on your bottles is of Pappy at a country club here in town with the dog pulling his clubs.
Right.
What's that picture?
It's it was actually staged by a fellow who worked for the AP, Associated Press back then. His last name was Hackett, and his wife actually sent me a letter several years ago, just kind of reminding me of the situation and how it happened. But he wanted to have Pappy pictured in this with his dog, hunting dog, pulling his golf clubs, and the caddy on the green holding the pin, and Pappy's chipping up on the green with his shorts on and his high top golf shoes and so forth. So it was pretty funny and very iconic picture, and we've gotten a lot of mileage out of that through the years with the back label of our 20-year-old bottle.
He's a bourbon executive. I mean, that's his bread and butter. Did he drink bourbon every day? I mean, how did he handle the consumption of bourbon? What did you witness and see now that you reflect back on it? Because it's everywhere now, and he was one of the trailblazers.
What I remember, and of course my sisters and McClure cousins would know more about it than I would, but I just remember him sitting in his chair, having a cocktail, and of course smoking his cigar. He would have at least one or two cigars, I'm sure, every day, and they're not great cigars. I think they were just cheap cigars, but just very sensible about it, and just a little drink here and there, and that every day, I'm sure, and that was obviously didn't hurt him.
No, did he have to sample the product too out at Stitzel Weller?
Oh, sure. There was. I remember going out there, and the sampling room was just a closed-in office space, and had several sample bottles from different barrels, and they were aged. So they tried different experimental type aging, not so much aging, but the proof of the whiskey and recipe changes and so forth. So, as with any bourbon business, creating new products, you have to try these products down the road and then wait a certain number of years. And if it's good, then you have to wait that period again for it to actually go on the market, because it's a long process.
Tell me about Nana. What was her influence in the family? What was her influence with Pappy?
She was, I'm sure, the ultimate entertainer. Always, the hostess with the mostest, I would say. She had a lot of parties at the house, business parties.
Great pictures of them dancing on the back porch there in the Highlands.
Yeah, that was their 50th anniversary, golden anniversary, where I was pictured in the book by my sister. Rather unflattering picture of me in my knock-knees, short pants, and so forth, with a scowl on my face. But I was probably, 4 or 5 at that picture. But they had a big time. And she would serve great parties and derby parties every year. And kind of the home base for any entertainment would bring them over to Nana and Pappy's house, the customers and sales reps and so forth.
The pictures I see of him, he always seems so happy. He seems to be having a great time.
Yeah, I don't know about anything other than that, because I never witnessed any tense situations, in the business situation since I was younger. But that was the way he always appeared to me also. In
his universe of bourbon manufacturing, there were really just a few big labels left, right? So, I mean, he didn't really... Did he feel the pressure to try to change the flavor palette or the proof of Old Fitzgerald at all? Or those brands?
No, he was old school, and he would he knew what he liked, and he knew that 100 proof bottled and bond bourbon was what he wanted to sell, which was Old Fitzgerald, and there was pressure in the 60s for to sell a product that would you get more whiskey out of the barrel, more liquid, and that was done by reducing the proof after you dump the whiskey out of the barrel, so to a 80 or 86 proof. But he would have none of that. He was only a 100 proof guy.
So he's been gone now for more than 50 years, and the popularity of the bourbon that you created in his honor, Pappy Van Winkle. What are the biggest myths about your grandfather that you hear that people say back to you and it just blows your mind today? Because he's on a figure in the bourbon industry, probably up there with Colonel Sanders or a figure like that has become bigger than life.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's just that I guess the thing that immediately comes to mind is people think that Pappy Van Winkle had the Pappy Van Winkle label, and he was the one that created it. Which is fine. They think that, but it was an afterthought, so to speak, for the third generation, which is me, to do that. But he pretty much was laid his cards on the table, and what you saw was what you got. So he was no smoke and mirrors and no tomfoolery. It was pretty much straightforward business.
So he would go to work, and then he'd come home, have dinner with Nana. Did he go to the racetrack a lot? Did you know anything about what he liked about Louisville? I know he liked his cigars and he liked to hunt. It was a pretty simple life.
It really was. I don't think he cared much about the horses, and therefore my father didn't either. So we didn't have much of a racetrack experience growing up. But I think those things, and of course traveling, maybe getting out of the nasty Louisville weather in the wintertime, going south, because they did go down to Florida, I'm sure, and enjoy themselves down there.
We're going to take a quick break. Coming up, we're going to talk about the creation of the famed bourbon. When did the first bottle appear? And as Pappy was ailing before he died at the age of 91, his wife had to break the news to him that he had to cut back on his bourbon consumption. Pappy's response is a classic you won't forget when we continue. As we are unlocking the true mystery of Pappy, I thought I'd take a second to invite you to learn about Louisville's true mystery. It's a real place, and it's Proffitt Report Podcast number 3. I'll give you a hint. Have you ever seen that door stuck into a side of a hill off Lexington Road as you are heading toward downtown, driving toward Payne Street? What's behind that door? Well, there's your clue. Louisville's true mystery is podcast number 3. And the music pouring from the Blue House in West Louisville is podcast number 9. You need an uplifting story in your life? Musician Keith Cook is a true local hero. Enjoy the Proffitt Report podcasts, all local. Now back to Pappy. The creation of the brand with his name on it. When did the first bottle of Pappy Van Winkle appear?
I have to check the record specifically, but
I've got it for you.
Okay.
I went back in my notes.
I'm thinking 95, 96, something like that.
You told me in a previous interview, and I'm with that like on a date, so I wanted to make sure I had it. December of 1994.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
So that's when it appeared, and I remember it around Louisville on shelves because of the distinctive photograph. Mm-hmm. It was easy to get until the moment it all changed, March 1997. What happened then? That was when something appeared that really that was when Pappy became what we all know now, the most hard to get bourbon in America or the world.
Yeah, that's kind of when people started noticing. We didn't do any advertising back then, couldn't afford it. Could barely afford to buy whiskey and put it in bottles and fill them and so forth. But our distributor in Chicago, unbeknownst to me, put our 20-year-old in a contest at the Beverage Tasting Institute, and a whiskey rating contest they would have every year. And I didn't know anything about it, but they did, and I got this notice that year that the whiskey had gotten a 99 rating, which was the highest any whiskey had ever scored, bourbon or scotch.
From Wine Spectator. It got a 99 from a wine magazine.
Well, that was published in the Wine Spectator, but it was the Beverage Tasting Institute that put out the ratings, and the Wine Spectator picked it up in a whiskey article, which was kind of odd for a wine magazine. So there weren't a lot of whiskey articles in wine magazines back then like there are now.
So how did you have 20-year Pappy in 1997. Was this the what was left over from the Stitzel Weller supply?
No, this was actually this was some whiskey that had not sold at a younger age, so it was excess whiskey, and I wanted obviously to not let it just evaporate. So I luckily found this great picture of Pappy, and we created this label with an artist friend of mine, and had the juice to put in there. And so at that point, I would seek out older whiskeys and let them age a little bit longer for the 20-year down the road. And eventually, it all became we would buy our old family whiskey back from our old distillery, Stitzel Weller, and to put in there.
Who bottled the original Pappy for you?
I did myself. I had the bottling facility I bought in Lawrenceburg, which I bought in 1983, and we had that facility, or I did. It was just a warehouse and a bottling facility, and it's where all the Pappy labels were created and bottled, and all the my other ages too, along with the rye whiskey and so forth, until 2002 when we sold it, and that's when I hooked up with Buffalo Trace at that point.
We ought to say that the early years were tough for you. I mean, people see the great success now, and how the bourbon is just on a level that people fall down over to get. But you spent many years really running to the bank. You told me.
Yeah, it was 25-year success story, I guess, or 30-year success story. But, didn't get a whole lot of paychecks back then because everything any money I made would pump back into the business. So that was the business of selling the whiskey was profitable, but this money pit in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, the bottling operation was the drain. So anything I had excess, I would keep that place operating, but it did its job.
Were you doing another job at the same time, and this was something you were doing on the side to try to get going, or did you buy the Lawrenceburg place?
Yeah, I bought it. My dad, after we sold the Stitzel Weller, they bottled, that would be from 1972 until he passed away in 1981. Fitzgerald or Stitzel Weller bottled our whiskey for us because we were using their whiskey and a couple of other brands. As you may or may not know, distilleries can buy other barrels from other distilleries and put their name on it, and you can still do that today.
What was the name of your whiskey at the time they were bottling?
Just Old Rip Van Winkle.
Old Rip Van. So that was the original.
Yeah, that's the only thing we took with us from Stitzel Weller was the brand name. And they didn't, the people we sold the distillery to were not interested in the Old Rip Van Winkle label. So that's what Dad started putting his whiskey that he had made at Stitzel Weller in the Old Rip Van Winkle bottle. So, in 1981, Stitzel Weller kindly asked me to go take a hike and find my bottling elsewhere because they were really doing it for a favor for Dad. Mm-hmm. So that's when I sought out the old Hoffman distillery down in Lawrenceburg. And it was run by some people named Wertheimer in Cincinnati, and they bottled my whiskey along with theirs. There was no distillery. It had been torn down in the 70s, and it was just a bottling operation, a warehouse situation, as I mentioned. But they bottled for me, and then they eventually went out of business with their decanters. They were selling Hoffman decanters, so I was, I guess, forced to buy it from them to stay in business.
And you were making Old Rip Van Winkle in Lawrenceburg?
Yes, bottling it there.
Okay.
Not making anything, but just bottling.
So if the first bottle of Pappy appeared in December of 1994, when did you come across that photograph? We're going to talk about that for a little bit now.
I'm guessing a year or so before that, maybe. It takes quite a while to get these labels designed and printed, and we did it very nicely with gold leaf press on there and embossing and so forth. So it was a nice looking label, but it took a while to get it going. So.
And you found it as you were going through papers. There mm-hmm. It is.
Yeah.
Okay. What we did research when we profiled Pappy in 2014. The photograph was taken in 1959 by the Louisville Times photographer Charles Fentress. He was doing a business article on Pappy at the time for the Louisville Times, and Pappy told reporters, or he told in that article, no good bourbon whiskey was ever made north of the Ohio River.
There you go.
So the photograph launched the label. You had always wanted to honor your grandfather, and mm-hmm. that was the way to do it. And the photograph itself is mythic. People think about the ring of smoke, that it's either applied on there or what, but that's the way it was shot, right?
Oh yeah, we just took a print of that label and put it. I mean, that that picture and put it on the label. People think the smoke is a beard or a goatee. Mm-hmm. They don't really examine it too closely, which maybe you can't tell on the label. But no, it's just the exact replica of whatever was in that picture.
So March 1997, Wine Spectator gives you a 99 rating. Now, back then, folks, 97, we still got magazines. We still got Wine Spectator in the stores. You had to go find them and get them and all that kind of stuff. Really, the internet hadn't developed on this. So its impact was probably even more so then because it was there in print.
Right.
It came out. How fast did things change after that happened? When did you say something's going on here?
I guess when the phone started ringing from distributors around the country saying, where can I get some of this highly rated whiskey? Because human nature is that, as you know, that whether it be wine or whiskey or whatever, if it's rated highly, people want to try it to see if it's got to be good, right?
They'll pay anything to get it.
Exactly. So so the phone started ringing, and I got new distributors, and things started to pick up a little bit at that point. I was kind of put on the map, I guess.
Did you feel like Jed Clampett hitting the oil well?
Pretty much. It wasn't an oil well. It was just maybe a small pot of gold or dollars sitting in the road, but it wasn't. It was better than nothing.
But you had a limited supply.
Yeah. Well, that back then I didn't have a limited supply because bourbon was readily available in the mid-90s from other distilleries, and that's what I was buying, was barrels from other distilleries, and I sourced it depending on whether it was going in decanters we were selling or under our Van Winkle or Pappy Van Winkle label. That would get the best of the best, which at that point normally was our old Stitzel-Weller whiskey, which was excess also, so that's why they sold it to us.
What did the review like about your 20-year bourbon? Do you remember what they said?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I'll have to go back and read the description of it, but it was more of a, the age of the whiskey was something unheard of. 20-year-old bourbon was not sold back then. That's what my family has always enjoyed selling because the weeded recipe tends to age more gracefully than others, so it kind of maintains its creaminess and smoothness and so forth, so it doesn't get much of a bite on it. So that's probably what the article mentioned as far as the flavor of the whiskey. But the 20-year was something that it was very rare.
Now, when you see the frenzy that people go to get your bourbon, and I'm sure you get personally bugged by it, how do you handle it?
Well, it's better than the phone not ringing at all. So it can be bothersome that people get angry because they can't find it, and the worst part about it, I guess, is the bad press you might get comes from individuals saying that we're holding back inventory and to keep prices high, or there was a theft that we all orchestrated to make the whiskey more famous and so forth. But it's basically we're selling every drop we have, so it's obviously being made 10 to 23 years ago, which is our age profile now. You can't just bottle this stuff today. Make it today and sell it today. Despite
the theft and the convictions at Buffalo Trace, you've remained with them. Are you happy with their security measures now?
Yeah, they've pumped up their game considerably for their own benefit also. So there's cameras and all types of cages and locked up situations. So it's almost wasn't a good thing, but it's it woke us all up as far as what to do as far as holding on to your product.
Did you ever once consider getting the production of Pappy out of there because of that?
Not really, just because that's such an ordeal as far as starting over production from another distillery. You don't know what their flavor profile is going to be for their whiskey because every distillery produces a different product because of their equipment and yeast and so forth. So that would be a long, arduous journey to try and get another supplier right off the bat.
I think what you talked about the bad press from holding back supply. You're putting out everything you have, but what has been revealed a lot lately it's not you all holding it back. It's the liquor stores when they get in. They hide them for preferred customers, or they keep them back. What is your opinion on that practice? Would you rather have Pappy out on the shelf, visible to people?
Sure. I tell people we don't make it for y'all to hoard it. We want you to drink it. And holding on to 25 bottles of whatever is it's not a good idea because you can't take it with you if you go. Your children and your heirs will enjoy it, but you won't. So I would say enjoy it. So And it, the stores that are taking advantage of the shortage of supply, obviously it's up to them to whatever they want to price the whiskey at. But a lot of this price gouging has got us not too happy about that, because I can't believe they would do that to their customers.
Because when you sell a bottle of Pappy, you sell it at your retail price, which people probably don't know. Because what goes through your mind, Julian, when you see these prices on the internet for the bottle of bourbon that you're producing?
It's there's a couple of things that come to mind and very important. Our 5 different whiskeys, or 6, including our rye whiskey, are retail priced, and this is controlled all over the country. We have a suggested retail price, and our distributors sell it at a normal markup to the retailers or restaurants. But our prices are anywhere from $60 for the 10-year up to, say, $275 or $280 for the 23, which is, people don't believe that because they'll be buying it or seeing it in a store for $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, and that's just the liquor stores taking advantage of the shortage of supply. And also this internet sales situation where people are buying bottles and then reselling them is totally illegal. And also there's a lot of counterfeits out there. So you're not buying from a licensed dealer or a liquor store. There's no guarantee of what's in that bottle. So you're taking you could be throwing your money away on a cheap bottle of colored water or whatever.
Do you ever go after these people? Have you ever prosecuted anyone for this? Have you wasted your time on that?
The counterfeit part is becoming huge, and empty bottles are bought on eBay. You can see them. They can't sell full bottles of whiskey on eBay, supposedly. You can on Craigslist, so that's everywhere. But it's a problem, and we obviously don't suggest doing that, because it's you're going to get something you're not really paid for.
Talking about the Great Pappy Heist, when that story broke, I think you were overseas. I think you told me you maybe were in London,
Paris,
and the way you handled that was saying very little.
Well, we didn't know that much, and what am I going to tell people? I don't know anything what's going on. Even if I was sitting at home, I wouldn't know what was going on. So it was an ongoing investigation. So I know you all like to ask, being the press, a lot of information. Get some information.
World headlines.
Oh yeah, it was all over the place. I can't go anywhere that people don't mention the theft, so to speak. So it just happened, and then all of a sudden they've caught the people and did a great job of catching them, and it's done now. So we're over that.
What's your opinion of the folks who hold the lotteries to sell Pappy, and then you see the lines around the liquor stores? At one point there was Pappy Fest in town to sell the supply.
Right. No, I think it's just another way to do it. Lotteries are raffles for charity and so forth. So a lot of these stores have done a great job of selling raffle tickets, and the profits above their cost go to charity. But it's a fair way to sell the whiskey. Take a chance at getting a ticket, and you get in the line, and then they pull your number, and you have a chance to buy one of the bottles. So, and it's not just our whiskeys; it's several different ones out there that are in short supply. So I think it's a good way to do it.
So people probably think you drive around town with a trunk full of Pappy. You probably asked for the bottle. Is it every day? People ask if you can get them some Pappy.
Probably, or that, or a donation for their charity and so forth.
And I tell me some of the best excuses or lines you've heard that people have laid on you to try to get a bottle.
Ooh. Well, my son Preston gets most of these emails because I guess they go to the website, and that's direct to his email. But a lot of them are, sick people, war veterans, dying of terrible illness, and just never have tried it, and you never know if they're true or not. So it's a tough job to say no, because you just that's not my nature to do that, number one. But it's also, you just don't know the truth of the situation, and there are hundreds and thousands of other people that want a bottle also. So I don't know how you pick. So that's why this lottery situation is good, or some stores just give it to the best customers. But does that guy go to the bottom of the list if he gets a bottle? So there's no real fair way to do it other than just a lucky situation where you get one.
Is it your policy now where you just say blanket no because it's easier, or do some of these stories you actually go ahead and arrange get them a bottle?
Oh yeah, most of the business travel I do, and my son Preston does, is charity work, and we'll do a charity event. I was just in Kiowa for a couple weeks ago for something called Gourmet and Grapes, and they raised money, hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Hollings Cancer Center in Charleston, South Carolina. So the charity work is very rewarding and makes us feel good about everything, and we're doing some good. So that's the great part, and the amount of money that these bottles bring at charities, auctions, and so forth is just astounding.
Your family has managed to, I'd say, stay pretty normal, considering you've been thrown into the world stage. I'm interested in your view of when people approach you and you see how they react to your product. It's an interesting reaction, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a little uncomfortable because I'm not, I haven't changed. I may have gone to my head a little bit because I get so much notoriety, but it's a little odd to have the selfies taken and the pictures and signing stuff and crazy. So I'm happy that it's happened, but it's a little uncomfortable to do it. But I'm glad to do it because it makes them happy, and we're very appreciative of what's happened with our brand. We've been really lucky and blessed.
Do you believe there will be a bubble in the bourbon industry? What's your view on that generally? And I suppose, is demand still really strong for Pappy Van Winkle?
Yep, it is. We've upped production. Say if we were making 2,000 cases in 2002 and it's 9 or 10,000 12-bottle cases now, you still don't notice because the demand keeps going up because of the press and the notoriety of the brand and the success of bourbon, period. And, Kentucky's being touted as the East Napa Valley, so to speak, and the Bourbon Trail and so forth. So it's great because at this point, I don't see an end to it. You think it's going to end at any moment. But if it does, I'm looking at this map of the world, and we sell 90-something% of our product here in the United States and export very little of it, which is another misconception of our whiskey all goes to China. And that's why you can't find it in Kentucky or whatever, which is totally untrue. We don't sell a drop to Asia. But there's plenty of other markets out there that we could access and sell to if this one kind of goes south on us.
Will you keep Pappy Van Winkle family owned?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's no reason. I mean, I can't imagine doing anything else. I mean, I talk to people that are kind of in my same idea, family business. What would you do? Whether they're an eye surgeon or in the rock business or whatever, it's a family business. What would I do without it? And I don't want to retire. So it's kind of like you'll have to put us out to pasture someday if we start to lose it. But it's something that we wouldn't even think about selling at this point or not having control of.
Your son Preston will take over.
Yep, he is, and he's got his 3 sisters behind him that have their own business, of course. So it's still going to remain a family business.
What about them? They've created a Pappy Van Winkle bourbon store, which is in Nulu, right across from Feast Barbecue. Mm-hmm. So they have a retail store where you can walk in and you can buy everything, but I guess the bourbon there, right?
Right. We've licensed them to sell our brand, and it's a lifestyle of different products, bourbon balls, bourbon syrup, and glasses, and furniture, and clothing, and so forth. And it's called Pappy and Company, and they were just online until last few months, where we've bought this building, or I've bought this building in Nulu, and it's very nice and beautiful. So they have a retail presence down there too, and they're doing great. So they have their own shipping situation down there too. And one of my daughters has an interior design business, Chenault James, and she's got her business in there too. So it's all under one roof. It's really nice.
So in the end, if somebody really wanted to honor your grandfather like you did, you set out to do, it's really probably exploded in more so than you were even intending to do in the early 90s. I mean,
oh yeah, by far. I had no idea. This was just something to sell another way to sell some whiskey. And people say, when did this all start to happen, or what was the culmination of, when did it start? How can you explain it? And we had a lot of help in our success as far as different people along the line. So it was many people that added to our success and helping us along the way. But it's a fun ride, I'll tell you that.
Now, as we were wrapping up our story with you, when you gave us the home film, we interviewed the family that lives in Pappy and Nana's house, mm-hmm. and they believe Nana is still there, that it's inhabited by her spirit.
I'm not surprised because the people that after Nan and Pappy died, that bought the house on Hill Road, there were some strange occurrences there of some dishes being moved and doors shutting and just a lot of weird stuff going on. So they actually sold the house, and the folks that are there now, maybe Nana likes them better. I don't know, but it hasn't reoccurred as far as any haunting, so to speak.
There was the rocking chair that she liked, which they would see it moving.
Right. Yeah.
And after a party they would have, the things would be moved around in the kitchen,
cleaned up. So unexplainable things. So who knows? The spirit world is something we all don't know anything about yet, but maybe someday somebody will get that figured out. But it's pretty fascinating. Now
I'll close by telling the story that I promised, and this came from your sister. As Pappy is in his final days. Again, he died at age 91 in 1965 in that house in Louisville. Nana would say, "Now, Julian, remember, the doctor told you he didn't want you to have too much," talking about bourbon. And Pappy would say, "Well, he didn't want me to have too little either."
There you go. That pretty much says it all. It's he asked him just to get the right amount each day, and he never did. He never got too much. In my lifetime, I didn't witness that. So he had it just about right. So the cigars and whiskey finally did him in at the age of 91. So I think he did all right.
What a life. And what a great life. And he's got to be so proud of you and what you've created here with his likeness and his name.
Yep, I'm sure he is. He and my father both. So, like I say, I'm sorry they didn't get to witness the success of what they had going back then these days, because they were doing it. It was just a little too early in the decade.
So I'll ask you, do they make any good bourbon north of the Ohio?
Well, I'm yet to try any really good bourbon, but there is sure a lot of good whiskeys out there, and I've tasted some that surprised me. I can't go advertising for those folks right at the moment, but I'm sure it can be done. But Kentucky's obviously, with the weather and the water and the expertise of the folks that are here, this is definitely the best place to make it, and that's where it started. So we think we've got it in pretty good.
All right. Julian Van Winkle III, the founder and the creator of the bourbon, Pappy Van Winkle, and the grandson of the legendary bourbon executive himself. That's been this edition of the Proffitt Report Podcast. Thank you for listening. If you want to reach me and respond or give us a review of the podcast, don't forget the email address is dproffitt. That's DPROFFITT at WHAS11.com. And this has been a production of WHAS 11 Media.